This collection was designed not to revive MacDonald's literary reputation, but to spread his religious teaching. It must be more than 30 years ago that I bought Fantasties. A few hours later, I knew that I'd crossed a great frontier. What it actually did to me was to convert, even to baptize, my imagination. It did nothing to my intellect, nor, at that time, to my conscience. Their turn came far later, and with the help of many other books and men. But when the process was complete, I found that I was still with MacDonald, and that he had accompanied me all the way, and that I was now at last ready to hear from him much that he could not have told me at that first meeting. But in a sense, what he was now telling me was the very same that he told me from the beginning. There was no question of getting through to the kernel and throwing away the shell, no question of a gilded pill. The pill was gold, all through. This is Pints with Jack, Season 7, Episode 38, MacDonald Month, George's Anthology, Part 1, After Hours with Dr. Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson. Welcome everyone. Here on Pints with Jack, we're reading our way through the works of C.S. Lewis. And today, we near the end of MacDonald Month. We have 2 episodes on George MacDonald and Anthology, a book which is a collection of MacDonald quotations assembled by C.S. Lewis. And our opening quotation comes from the preface of that book, where Lewis describes the impact MacDonald had on him, and where he explains his goal in assembling the anthology, namely to spread MacDonald's religious teaching. And that's what we're going to be examining today, the preface of that book, under the guidance of the very special returning guest, Dr. Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson. Dr. Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson first appeared on Pints with Jack back in Season 5, where she spoke about MacDonald and his book Fantasties. Dr. Jeffrey Johnson is a MacDonald scholar who lives in the Ottawa Valley, Canada, and she has written about him on popular blogs such as The Rabbit Room, as well as in academic journals like Northwind, Zenzucht, and Lingua Culture. She has contributed to various books on MacDonald, as well as new editions and adaptations of his works, as well as co-editing a book with Michael Partridge called Informing the Inklings, George MacDonald and the Victorian Roots of Modern Fantasy. She's also spoken about MacDonald in Oxford, Cambridge, St Andrews, and numerous places around the United States and Canada, as well as at various events hosted by the C.S. Lewis and Kindred Spirits Society in Romania. Dr. Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson, welcome back to Pints with Jack.
Thank you so much, David. It's a pleasure to be back.
Well, it's lovely to have you back. But I'm guessing it's actually probably a very busy time for you at the moment as a MacDonald scholar, given that it's his bicentennial this year.
Yeah, it's an incredibly busy time for myself and for others. I feel like I'm juggling a few too many things at the moment. But I'm also really excited to share with folks some of the things that are going on. Many of you will know that the first bicentenary conference hosted by the George MacDonald Society has just happened at Wheaton, co-hosted by the Wade Center. And it was a delightful gathering of all manner of names. And I'm going to list some of them just because I think they'll be relevant to your audience. And there will be recordings to follow up on that, as well as many of these papers will be published. So Trevor Hart was there, Malcolm Geit, Andrew Peterson, Crystal Downey, Melody Green, Joe Rickey, Robert Garcia, Michael Phillips, Robert Trexler, Natalie Morell, Sarah Walters. I'm just trying to think of names that are particularly of interest to the Pints with Jack audience. Molly Z and Sarah Emtaj oversaw an art exhibition with art from lots of familiar faces. Shalice Stearns and Amanda Vernon oversaw an amazing musical evening with composers like Jack Redford and Josh Rodriguez. And it's just really exciting to see some of these people come together and share their love of MacDonald, as well as the work that they've done on him. Joe Rickey had a light princess play that we participated in. We got to hear songs by Andrew Peterson, Malcolm Geit, Joe, and others. We're just barely catching our breath now, and there will be, by now you'll be able to find online more information about our partner event in Scotland, in St Andrews on November 8th and 9th. There's going to be another big sort of sister conference for those in the UK and Europe. And there's some tourist adventures planned for the 10th, November the 10th for that. But there's also so much else going on that's not even society hosted. I gave a lecture in Toronto at Wycliffe College recently and was off to Trinity Western University for the Christianity and Lit conference that had an Inkling section. Some of you will know that's where the Canadian Inkling Society is hosted, and I did a bit on MacDonald there. In Ottawa, there's going to be an inaugural, that's one of the words I stumble over, performance of Sarah Emtaj's stage setting at The Princess and the Goblin at a Christian classical school, and I'll be doing a lecture after that. In October, Joyce McPherson and Malcolm Guide are going to be speaking on MacDonald at the Southeast Christianity and Lit Conference in Georgia. The Rabbit Room will be hosting some celebrations in December. I'll get to join in on. There'll be many others there. And then I'm zooming up from there to a 2-day conference at Yale on December 12th and 13th that's being co-hosted by Yale and Drexel that they hope will become a biannual event that's drawing together MacDonald scholars and will also have a musical component to that. As you folk know, there's been this wonderful month at Pints with Jack. Joe Ricky's online Inkling Folk Fellowship Zoom gatherings that are open to the public are highlighting MacDonald throughout the year. And he's bringing in artists and scholars and enthusiasts there. And there's also this year, there's work being done on a documentary. There's some film features that are being done. There's even more poetry being set to music, as well as pieces generally inspired by various scenes and stories from MacDonald by such great musicians as Ron Block and Tombra and Jack Redford. So there's a lot going on this year.
Yeah. And it's great to see. I'd only read Fantasties the last time we spoke. I've read a lot more in the process of this George MacDonald month. So I'm now much more of a fan. So it's nice to know that there's lots of stuff happening there. Today, I am enjoying a Best Day Brewing Kolsch. Are you drinking anything?
Yeah, I'm surprised your Kolsch isn't already half done by now. But I am drinking Hawthorn tea, Mayflower, for the merry month of May. And David, I don't know if you like this time of year, especially from my days in Oxfordshire, really miss those hawthorn hedgerows that are all in beautiful white bloom and smelling so gorgeous this time of year. And hawthorns are important to MacDonald, so it seemed apropos to me.
Beautiful. Cheers.
Slangeva.
So, listeners, on Thursday's episode, I'm going to be joined by my co-hosts to discuss their favorite quotations from this George MacDonald anthology. But in this episode, Dr. Johnson and I are going to focus on the preface and Lewis's assessment of MacDonald. But before we get to that, for those who didn't catch your appearance on season 5, Dr. Johnson, would you mind introducing yourself a little bit to our listeners? Tell us a little bit more about how you came to discover MacDonald and make him an area of scholarly study.
Cool. Yeah. I grew up here in the Ottawa Valley in the in-between world of being a farm kid and the kid of an academic. And it was a rich mix for which I'm now very grateful, although at times you often felt like one was falling between the cracks, never quite fitting in anywhere, or perhaps everywhere. After decades away and having lived in England and Scotland and France, I now find myself back in the very same rural county. And in addition to teaching and writing, I'm the director of a nonprofit called Windstone Farm Linlathen, through which I and a humblingly rich community of folks seek to facilitate and model hospitable relationship through engagement with theology, ecology, and the arts. And that's what we're seeking to do. We host events, conferences, and we've had plenty of Lewis and Inkling scholars and Pints friends here for our conferences, such as Malcolm Guide and Trevor Hart, Sharon Jebb Smith, Mark Scott, Jason Lepojarvi. They've all been part of this, as well as hosting concerts and book groups, ecological restoration, neighborhood hay gathering and cider making. All these things kind of intertwine with each other, which I think is really MacDonald-esque. I first read MacDonald when I was about 6 and immediately began consuming all of his children's writing that I could. In my early 20s, I took a course on John Bunyan at Regent College, Vancouver. And naively thinking I was taking some time off before working on my final essay, I picked up The Golden Key, which I hadn't read for years. And I was blown away by how deeply that fairy tale was engaging with Pilgrim's Progress, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, yet without impeding the magic of the fairy tale. And I think that's one of MacDonald's real gifts. I returned to MacDonald's literature then with new eyes. And not long afterwards, when I was working on another course at Regent, by then a Regent student, on spiritual discernment, I began to realize how formational MacDonald's children's literature had been on my own faith journey. It equipped me and taught me, it prepared me, it filled me with scripture without my even being aware of that. So this led to my master's dissertation at Regent on the educational nature of story and its devaluation in the modern Western church. It was whilst working on this master's that I not only did a deep dive into Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, but also some of Lewis's shorter writings on the power of story, especially the collection in Of This and Other Worlds. And these are what really got me curious about the concept of mythopoiesis, which of course then led to my PhD under Trevor Hart, who had just co-founded St. Andrew's Institute of Theology, Imagination, and the Arts. I was in the second year of that institute, which is still going and still doing amazing work. And it was a really rich time. There were a lot of great Lewis and MacDonald scholarship came out of that period. Sharon Jebb Smith was working there as a student there at the time. Michael Ward was a student. Gisela Kreglinger, Danny Gableman, Travis Buchanan, Phil Tannen, others that I'm going to forget in the moment. But we all overlapped, and we got to learn not only from the faculty and visiting scholars and artists like Malcolm, like Murray Watts, but also from colleagues who weren't directly working on Lewis or MacDonald, but knew their work and could enter into dialogue with us, something that's really important, I think. A few of those folk, like Shelley Stearns and Julie Canlis and Ivan Kovacs, are now, decades later, ending up spending more of their time as theologians working on MacDonald, which of course makes some of us pretty happy.
Yeah. You mentioned ecology at the beginning of that. We're actually going to have at least one episode, possibly two, on Inklings and ecology next season. A couple of listeners asked us about the connection. So I think Matthew Dickinson, I think he's one of the guys that I've got.
Yeah.
And I've got a few other possible ones. So we're going to dig into that a little bit more.
It's a surprisingly vast field once you start paying attention, start thinking about it.
Exactly. When it was first mentioned, I was like, I don't know anyone that's written about it. And then I started actually looking, and then there was actually quite a considerable amount. The other thing you mentioned there was how MacDonald interacts with a lot of other literature and also a lot of other biblical literature. I have actually just started reading The Princess and Curdie, and I just got to the Isaiah part. And for people that want to know what the Isaiah part is, you have to watch the documentary The Fantasy Makers, where Dr. Jeffrey Johnson talks about how that surprised her when she was reading. It was like, oh, Isaiah apparently read The Princess and Curdie.
Yeah, just for those of you who love doing, what did Lewis had a term for this? Oh, when you're hunting and looking for something in a book. But if you enjoy doing that, which Lewis clearly did, Princess and Curdie has over 100 direct references to Isaiah. Those are the direct ones. So you will have fun.
You can tell what MacDonald was reading at the time. Now, just there, you also mentioned Tolkien. And at the moment, we're recording this interview at the end of April 2024. And a written interview with you has actually just been released on Fellowship and Fairy Dust. And I'll make sure there's a link in the show notes. But I just want to ask you about one thing that you mentioned in that interview. And it was about J.R.R. Tolkien. What did he think of MacDonald?
This is hard to do even half decently briefly, so I'll try to be as quick as I can because I do think it's really important to dive into because I so often hear Tolkien didn't like MacDonald. Mm-hmm. You hear that line a lot. So Tolkien himself unambiguously claims at least some influence from MacDonald in several places and in several different types of influences. And your listeners will, I'm sure, be familiar with Lewis's enthusiastic description of Tolkien to his friend Arthur Greaves when he first meets them. And he says, he's the one man absolutely fitted. Fate had allowed to be a third in our friendship in the old days, for he also grew up on William Morris and George MacDonald. That was like the introduction of Tolkien to Lewis's best friend. So how do we then make sense of the fact that when he's asked to write an introduction to the Golden Key, he gets cranky about it and says that he doesn't really like MacDonald after all? I think partly the key is in the adjective cranky. And those of you who have read through Tolkien's letters and are more familiar with Tolkien will understand that. I don't think I've ever read anyone who self-contradicts more often than our friend J.R.R. Tolkien. And there are also some articles that are really helpful on this topic. And so from the links that you put up, folk will be able to follow through on those. I was recently talking to Sharon Schroeder, who's one of the people who've written on this topic, and as she rightly said, there's so much more to be said on it and much more research to be done on it. But, I'm really big on context. Context is so important, so helpful. Don't take your scripture verses into context. Well, dating Tolkien's comments, as well as being familiar with his personality and his contradictory outbursts, does help. When he was in his late 40s, Tolkien published a letter in a British newspaper, so completely voluntary, right, and publicly, in which he openly acknowledges MacDonald's influence. So in his 40s, he's like, MacDonald influences me. We also know by this time he is regularly reading MacDonald to his children. And Patricia, his daughter, has memories of this. His kids have talked about this. Biographers have talked about the fact that he's regularly choosing to fill his children with MacDonald at this point in time. He gets to his 50s, and he's still quite laudatory. And this is when he writes the essay on fairy stories, essay that he says is quite possibly the most important thing I've ever written, is what he says in his 50s. And for those of you familiar with MacDonald's seminal essay, The Imagination, you will know that many of the concepts in On Fairy Stories are going to be really familiar to you if you've read the essay on The Imagination. And in that essay, Tolkien writes, and I'm going to read the quotation here, "The magical, the fairy story may be used as a mirror l'homme, and it may, but not so easily, be made a vehicle of mystery. This at least is what George MacDonald attempted, achieving stories of power and beauty when he succeeded, as in The Golden Key, which he called a fairy tale, and even when he partly failed, as in Lilith, which he called a romance." So that's a sentence that's still in that essay now, but earlier versions of the manuscript include other sentences that not only name MacDonald as a source of Tolkien's concept and understanding of goblins, but also, this is, I think, a really important sentence in there. Tolkien says, "For me, at any rate, fairy stories are especially associated with Scotland, not through any special knowledge, but simply by reason of the names of Andrew Lang and George MacDonald. To them, in different ways, I owe the books which most affected the background of my imagination since childhood." So that's Tolkien's quotation there. And I think it's also worth noting that MacDonald's one of only two authors that he mentions favorably in this essay. Then we get to his mid-70s. So that was in his 50s, right? We get to his mid-70s. And Tolkien's biographers will talk about how he is more cantankerous in this stage and more contradictory. He's struggling with some things. But he is asked to write a preface for the new edition of The Golden Key, and he accepts. But as he begins to work on the project, he becomes increasingly critical, increasingly grumpy about the story. And this is when he writes the negative comments that we hear quoted. So, his full life before then, we've got all sorts of other things. So it's unfortunate that that's what people grab onto. I think in some ways, as I said in the article, I think it's somewhat providential, perhaps, that the project fell through on the publisher's side, not so that any cranky comments weren't published, but because out of his dissatisfaction with the story, Tolkien writes Smith of Wootton Major, which I think is beautiful. I think in some ways quite MacDonald-esque. Nobody told Tolkien I said that. It's itself a mystical story of power and beauty, and it's his last complete story. I think it's also useful to remember that what Tolkien didn't like in Lewis, what he didn't like in Arthurian stories is what he doesn't like in MacDonald. So that's helpful for us to remember. I think it's important maybe just to land with, and people have, and you can think about all the different resonances you can see throughout Tolkien's work. And I think there's some pretty strong ones, even some scenes that are pretty strong resonant scenes. But if Tolkien, who grew up reading MacDonald, liked him well enough that it was a point of resonance between him and Lewis, and then he chooses to feed his children upon those fairy tales, then regardless of cranky assertions, there's certainly credence to his own claim that MacDonald did influence not only specific moments or creatures, but also, to use Tolkien's words, the background of his imagination. And I think that's what we need to remember.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I always just want to give a little bit of time and a little bit of light to these sorts of issues, because I hear so many things repeated on the internet and in popular culture that are just wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Holly Ordway at the conference at the end of the year, the Undiscovered C.S. Lewis conference, she's going to be talking about Tolkien and Narnia, and it is far more complicated than a lot of people would like to portray, both Tolkien's relationship with Lewis at the end of his life as well as his opinion of his works. So I always want to make sure that we give a little bit of time just to settle people down before they start making pronouncements like, oh, he hated such and such.
Yeah. And I think we're naturally drawn to the, if I can say, the fallacious and the salacious.
Yes.
It's more fun, right, than the actual complexity of true humanity.
Well, with that done, let's now talk about the preface to George MacDonald and Anthology. It begins with Lewis saying that the only sources of information he had about MacDonald, and this is quite incredible when we think about MacDonald studies today, but C.S. Lewis, the greatest champion of MacDonald probably that there's ever been, he says, all I knew about him was what I read from his books and from one biography. And I haven't read the biography. I know that G.K. Chesterton wrote I think it was the foreword in the introduction, which means that it's going to have to go on my bookshelf very soon. But is there anything that you think is worth mentioning about that biography?
Yeah. I think maybe I'll just start by saying that Wing Lion Press, Bob Trexler's press, has just reissued a new version. So it used to be really hard to get your hands on. It was on Gutenberg on the internet because it's out of copyright. But Joseph John Flynn has done a beautiful job of pulling that back together and with Bob reproducing it. And so it's easy to access now. You can buy it from Wing Lion Press, which is a huge boon. The book is written by Greville, published in 1924 for the centenary, so 100 years ago, for the centenary of his father's birth, written after his father's death. And in so many ways, it's so important. It's got so much important information in it. I do think that, like any biography, it behooves us to ponder what the author's biases might be. Mm-hmm. It is not imperfect. And I think I'd sort of heard little bits and bobs about, grumblings here and there about problems with Greville's biography. But it wasn't until I went and spent 2 weeks at Yale in the Beinecke Library, where there rests the largest collection of MacDonald archival material, and started reading through the letters. And I think the first thing I came across was horror, discover that some of the letters had crossed out. Somebody had crossed out with a red pencil some things in some of the letters. And I was like, who the heck would do that? And then started to realize that it was actually Greville who had done that in some of the letters. And there's actually other collections of MacDonald's letters that I think it'd be good to revisit a publication of these things, because there are other letters that leave bits out. And so you think MacDonald has just said, WXZ, but he's actually said Y as well. And Y might be really important in understanding the rest of the text. But sometimes people, and this happens in all fields, sometimes people will just omit a paragraph or a sentence that they're not comfortable with, but actually might misrepresent the author. And Greville does that in spades. So in a lot of the letters that he transcribes, it's not just for sake of brevity, but if there's something that he's not super keen on, he will leave them out, or he'll change it a little bit. And so that, and starting to read the actual letters and realizing what Greville had changed, helped me have a better sense of who Greville was, and then also perhaps how he might be representing things. He was a Harley Street doctor, so he's a posh doctor. And according to his family, according to other siblings, he was a bit embarrassed by his family's pushing boundaries of social acceptability and respectability. He was really uncomfortable with their acting on stage, because respectable people don't act on stage. And so there's stuff with his family that was tough for him. And he's definitely not keen on his father's retention of speaking, especially when he goes back home in Lowland Scots. That's a bit embarrassing to him. And so, again, I've discovered in the letters, he'll change the text. My grandmother, who only spoke in proper English, said blah, 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 blah. And then I go back and find the letter he's quoting, and she's writing in Scots, in Lowland Scots. She's not writing in proper English at all. So he quite misrepresents that. And to help and maybe defend Greville a little bit, or to help to understand this culturally, at that point in time, MacDonald's getting attacked by readers in the press whilst he's writing, when he's publishing his novels, for choosing to be, this is really hard. This is back to importance of context. It's hard for us to understand this today. especially an era when like we're promoting languages, when the BBC no longer, RP is no longer required, right? Accents are celebrated. But MacDonald's getting attacked by readers in the press for choosing to be so vulgar as to use actual Scottish dialect instead of cleaning it up for his more refined readers like Walter Scott did. There are articles where people write in complaining like, you expect me to debase myself by reading this low, vulgar language? He gets attacked for describing in detail lowly dirt floor huts. And we have to remember, again, this is the era when pre-Raphaelites are starting to paint Christ in the carpenter shop with a dirt floor. And people like even Charles Dickens are writing in letters and saying, this is heretical. This is not respecting the divine by representing it in such lowly and vulgar circumstances, right? And so I think for MacDonald,
kind of need to reread Philippians.
And for MacDonald, this is central to what he's doing. And so it's so important to him that he does pull us into the vernacular, because that's the incarnation. I don't think Greville really got that. And so Greville's often trying to remove that from the text. He hears people talking about his father being painfully provincial, vulgar, and base. I mean, I'm going to read you, there's just one little example to show you. So there's in one place in the biography, he talks about his grandmother's involvement in banking. And he notes that until a better means was procured for keeping the bank money safe in the family, she had it placed in the family trunk, the family kist. Okay, and he even references the letter from his uncle, George MacDonald's brother, from whom this information comes. I'm not going to even attempt the dialect here, but what Charles actually writes is, I cannot but be reminded of asking my grandmother once if, when they had a bank in such premises as they had at the time, she was not afraid of robbery. To which she replied, nay, nay, laddie, I always took good care of the chop that was closed down to stick the notes and bills and put them in the second chamber pot under the bed. And if anybody came there, they get the one first with something in it before they got the other one. And that would awaken us. And sure that your father, so blah, blah, blah. Far more interesting, gives us a very different sense of the grandmother and the family, but for Greville at the time, too embarrassing. And also, like, I want to underscore, I can't read what Charles wrote, but he has his mother speaking in full Scots dialect in this memory. Also really important. Greville also, perhaps like any child writing a bio, wants to present his father's theology a little closer to his own. And although he helped, there was one other biography that came out at a similar time by a man named Joseph Johnson. And Greville helped him edit it. He proofed it. He corrected some errors. He was laudatory at the time. But years later, when he does his own biography, he's really publicly condemning of Johnson's work. And I think quite unnecessarily. I think Johnson actually has some really good stuff in there. So like all things, read multiple voices.
Sure. I honestly find this really encouraging, because in the preface, the next thing that Lewis talks about is MacDonald's relationship with his dad. He says that they had an almost perfect relationship. And that actually makes me kind of happy, because Lewis goes on in the preface to describe MacDonald as having an almost perfect relationship with his father, which was the earthly root of all his wisdom. From his own father, he said he first learned that fatherhood must be the core of the universe. Now, that's beautiful and inspiring, but I've got to say, as a father, I also have to say it's rather intimidating. And Lewis alludes to one of the sections from the Anthology later, 104, where MacDonald writes, "He who seeks the Father more than anything he can give is likely to have what he asks, though he is not likely to ask amiss." And so for MacDonald to talk about that as the relationship with our Heavenly Father, it speaks volumes about his relationship with his own earthly father.
And actually, just off the top of my head, that quotation reminds me of, I'm not good at remembering quotations off the top of my head, but it does remind me of, it's a parallel to another one by MacDonald when he talks about in one sense, in places about his relationship with his father, and then he also talks about God, his relationship with God with the same quotation, as when he says that God is easy to please, but hard to satisfy.
Yeah.
And I've got to say, I was talking about the letters in the archives. I really fell in love with George Sr. George MacDonald's father, when reading his letters to his son. And again, lovely to actually read the actual letters and not just what various people said about the relationship, because those letters show the relationship. They contain humor, pain, admonition, like he corrects his son, challenges his son. He doesn't just proffer guidance, he seeks guidance. He debates with him on things. He shows a love of place and a deep familial love. They reveal the poetic relationship George Sr. had with his environment. There are phrases like, as nature long detained from its summer garb is now getting into lovely verdure. I mean, this isn't just in a letter. Like it's like he's not setting it aside. That's just in the flow of the letter to his son. So you can see where the poetic language comes from. The value George Sr. held for all persons is manifested in his discussions of both servants and neighbors in the letters. I think we're really starting to see that the son doesn't come from nowhere. George Sr.'s clannish care, if you will, is shown as he keeps MacDonald generally up to date on the community in which he's born. Various people, like tells him how different people are doing. He expresses concern for different farmers who lose their land due to bankruptcy. He expresses concern very beautifully and gently for others who are struggling with addiction to alcohol. He is constantly using dork terminology. So you can see the value he places on the speech of people in his own language. For those not able to get into archives, because not everybody can go look at those amazing letters. There's a long poem by MacDonald, again, easily accessed on the internet, called The Disciple, which now that I've read those letters is clearly very autobiographical and definitely reflects what's in them well and shows that beautiful relationship. And it, like the letter, shows a father who's very ecumenical, who's very concerned about the environment and creation care, who's a cheerleader of his son. Like when MacDonald says, I think I should go to seminary, what are you talking about? Your gift is teaching. That's what you should be doing. You should be teaching. And he even says, by the way, there's this school over in Manchester, this guy starting it called A.J. Scott. I think you guys would really connect. I love that Scott doesn't demand that his students have to agree to a particular theological statement. He's not forcing them to take theology classes, but he teaches great theology classes. And he's saying this completely unaware that his son already knows A.J. Scott. And has already chosen A.J. Scott to be his mentor. And he doesn't even know that yet. So it shows how well he knows his son. George Sr. was well loved by his community, even those outside of the church. And he was also a fellow reader and discerner. Like they discuss only hymns. They discuss Darwin's Beagle when it comes out, Voyage of the Beagle. They discuss theology. Here's one more quotation. As far as I am able to see, the views of both of us are very much alike. This is what the father says to the son, discussing theology in the letter. Like you, I cannot by any means give in to the extreme points of either Calvinism or Arminianism. Nor can I bear to see that which is evidently gospel mystery torn to pieces by those who believe that there's no mystery in the scriptures and therefore attempt to explain away what is evidently for the honor of God to conceal. I see so much mystery in nature and so much of it in myself, that it would be a proof to my mind that the scriptures were not from God, were there nothing in them beyond the grasp of my own mind. As to the responsibility of man and his power of choice, I think there can be no doubt. This is the father. This isn't George MacDonald, our author, writing. This is the father. But I think this is really important on your comment about fatherhood, and something that I don't know if Lewis saw right away. I think that he started to see this. But George MacDonald Sr. not only taught his son about fatherhood, but about childlikeness. He's clearly fun, playful, joyful. When MacDonald dies in 1905, a common refrain in the obituaries throughout the UK was that the shift in emphasis on God as condemning judge to God as loving father that had occurred in theological discussions half a generation before had really entered the minds of the public, the congregational understanding through the literature of George MacDonald. There's multiple obituaries that comment on this when MacDonald dies. What I find really interesting about these discussions and Lewis's discussion of MacDonald's emphasis on the father love of God is that so often those discussions end up where I think many of us still end up today, thinking of ourselves really in terms of adult children of a father God. And James Houston, the founder of Regent College, who seemed convinced that I would write a PhD on George MacDonald before I was, asked me to contribute a chapter to his last collected book called Child Theology. And this is because Houston, who's also hugely shaped by, he knew Lewis, he was hugely shaped by MacDonald, but he is really shaped, well, he's in strong concurrence and I believe shaped by MacDonald's argument that most of us only get halfway through this important concept. MacDonald's first sermon in his series called Unspoken Sermons, which Lewis says everyone interested in the faith should read, anyone interested. There you go. David is showing me his copy. Lewis, it's hard to say how highly Lewis speaks of this collection of sermons. And the very first one's called The Child in Our Midst. And a lot of the quotations in the anthology come from this collection, like the majority of the quotations in the anthology. And so again, that's why I think it's important to emphasize this, that he sets the whole thing up with this sermon called The Child in Our Midst. And each sermon kind of follows in thread from the one before. And in that sermon, MacDonald explores Christ's really striking challenge to his disciples that unless we become childlike, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And that's harsh, right? These are men who've been traveling and studying with Messiah for considerable time already. It's not like they're new to the show. They're not new to the commitment. Yet Christ is saying there's a change that they still need to make, that they can make, that he's challenging them into. That to recognize God as Father is not sufficient. We must learn to become as little children. There's two pieces there, God as Father and us as children, as childlike. And there's something he repeats throughout his corpus, the difference between being childish and maturing into childlikeness. He highlights those resisting that maturation in, say, the little ones in Lilith. More frequently, the stupidity of people like Curdy, and that's the word he uses, the stupidity of growing out of wonder, growing out of humility, growing out of the hunger to learn, and more such childlike qualities that I think we see in Lewis. I mean, Narnia especially is an expression of this, right? And Lewis is continuing to dive into that. And I think in some places when exploring this theme, he really calls out academics. He's got an example of a really intellectually brilliant Dante scholar who MacDonald helps us understand is completely betraying his subject matter. And I think we see this in That Hideous Strength, right? He's betraying his subject matter because he spends most of his time with his nose in his books or writing and not actually practicing the call to relational living that actually defines the commedia, right? So he's betraying the commedia. Every human is greater than any book, writes MacDonald. And I think we see a progression in Lewis in understanding that. I think Lewis at first doesn't really get that every human is greater than any book, right? And he gets there, like he's on that journey. To understand is not more important than to love, says MacDonald. And George Sr., the father, really shapes. I hear him saying that, the young George MacDonald. I hear him saying, to understand is not more important than love, young man. Every human is not greater than any book, my son. And I think that's, to understand MacDonald, that's central. And I think in Lewis, we can see his journey in his understanding to that, to the point where we have Aslan doing what upon resurrection? Playing with the children is the first thing he does. Playfellows with God is MacDonald's phrase.
Oh my goodness. So many things to say on that. When you were talking about MacDonald Sr., talking about Calvinism and Arminianism, it's echoed in what Lewis says about MacDonald's own belief in a form of universalism. It's point for point exactly what he says in this preface. And your comment about loving is better than, in some ways, understanding. There's a scene in The Great Divorce where Lewis puts words in MacDonald's mouth. He says, haven't you ever known those who collect books but don't read them anymore? Those missionaries and theologians, that they no longer have any love for Christ, that there's something that has grown cold in them. And usually after desiring to be very grown up and important, which is this season, we have finally got to the last battle, and we've got to the issue of Susan, and that is her chief thing. She wants to grow up, and she refuses to be childlike anymore. I've only just started dipping into unspoken sermons, but I do get echoes of the theology of Saint Therese of Lisieux, the little flower, who described herself as just this little girl who lifts up her arms to her father so that he can lift her up.
Yes, yes. And both parts are necessary, right? The Father God
Mm,
is inviting us to be his children. So what does it mean to lift up our arms and be children?
mm. Well, we've mentioned Calvinism already, and
Mhm.
Lewis has got a section in the preface about Calvinism. And when you were on the show back in season 5, we spent a little bit of time talking about some of the very popular misconceptions about MacDonald's relationship with Calvinism. But the point that Lewis makes in the preface is that, unlike other people who have left that particular theological system, it was very common for them to not only hate the theology, but then all of the associations and the
Yeah.
people that were involved. But he says, of such personal resentment, I find no trace in MacDonald. In this way, MacDonald illustrates not the doubtful maxim that to know all is to forgive all, but the unshakable truth that to forgive is to know, and a line that I'm sure Andrew absolutely loves, he who loves sees.
Yes. Yeah. It's so beautiful and so true. And I think there's a lot of people that, because of their own hurt and pain, see MacDonald as a bit of an icon or champion for them in some of their own struggles, perhaps being hurt by various expressions of Calvinism, and then see him as an anti-Calvin icon.
Hmm.
And I think that would make MacDonald really sad, actually. I'm glad you're going to dive into some of the questions and some of these ideas more fully in the future, because this one alone warrants an entire podcast for sure. As you've intimated, we for sure need to remember, like a lot of isms, there are many different expressions of Calvinism. I think in this conversation around MacDonald, it's really important, and something that Lewis didn't really know that well, nor Chesterton when he writes. And Chesterton writes about MacDonald in various places, also didn't quite realize how diverse MacDonald's own family upbringing was. So,
Hmm.
yes, he had a grandmother who had left her husband's Catholic leaning Presbyterian church for a new startup church, non-denominational church that was federal Calvinist. So read very conservative. And, again, in her defense and defense of the church, many scholars fail to recognize how much more broad that very church was by the time MacDonald was born. Like, it didn't stay there. It changed in many ways itself. I doubt that the woman who burnt her husband's old fiddle so that it would not tempt her sons would have taken the same action by the end of her life. Like, it just wouldn't be
Mm.
consistent, right? She changes. I mean, she actually even has more positive feelings about Catholics, and in her prayer for Catholics, she knows by the end of her life, where earlier on that would not have been the case. Like, she changes. It's so easy for us to think of people as static individuals.
Hmm.
MacDonald's mother was the child of an Episcopalian priest. One uncle was a free church minister, and he fought hard to keep Gaelic or Gallic customs and culture alive. That includes Celtic prayers. And he actually trains pastors in Gaelic to help fight the loss of that culture, which is surprisingly un-Calvinistic. This is a culture that still, by the time those people are coming over to settle in my county, are revering saints. Yeah, I think we sort of get these stock pictures in our brain that are often not correct. As intimated, George Sr., MacDonald's father, was very content to disagree with the minister. He's good friends with him. He debated with him. He disagreed with him. They would discuss different theological perceptions. I think if we're to be certain of any theologian with particular influence on MacDonald's family home, it would be the ecumenically oriented. He worked really hard in this area: literature, science, and arts loving, community facilitating, educating, promoting Thomas Chalmers. And a lot of cities across North America, basically, I would guess probably in the Antipodes too, anywhere where Scots settled, there are Chalmers churches. They're all over the place. And Chalmers was a close friend of one of MacDonald's maternal uncles. And MacDonald was sufficiently familiar at the age of 13 with Chalmers' writings that he could give recitations of his sermons for fun. Apparently, there's like the stories of him standing up on the kitchen table with a bunch of the farm hands with him reciting his memorization of Chalmers' sermons. Chalmers was a big influence, but as I said, this is a guy who's really ecumenically oriented, who loves science, who loves dialogue, who loves literature, who loves the local language. And we can't forget how well educated MacDonald's own parents were, with classical education, with languages. The church that MacDonald grew up in produced scholars and missionaries and pastors who end up in a variety of denominations and disciplines, and who come back to speak on topics as varied as MacDonald comes back in his young adulthood to speak on Tennyson. He's got kids from his Sunday school class who come back to speak on Confucius. So again, that's sort of like dispelling some of our conceptions of what this supposedly repressive Calvinistic community was that MacDonald grew up in. It's not fact. There was unquestionably a repressive version of conservative Calvinism active in the community, but that's not the only expression of faith that was there. And in fact, that expression in the community of conservative Calvinism, MacDonald at one point actually identifies as, he calls it, quote unquote, American Calvinism that has tainted Scotland. So that's really interesting. So he's actually viewing that repressive version as not being something that's arisen out of Scotland's historic engagement with Calvin, but rather something that's come from somewhere else and is changing Scotland's expression of Calvinism. Really interesting. I'd love to see somebody spend some more work on that. He definitely rails against oppressive Calvinism, but he also talks of Calvinism being very different in places from Calvin himself. He talks about some Calvinists in one story not being worthy to tie Calvin's shoelace. And there are people who are now working on this topic. I know a few people who are trying to parse out more carefully where not just what MacDonald really thinks about different expressions of Calvinism, but actually where MacDonald and Calvin agree. They disagree in places, but they actually agree in a number of really important places. And this ties back to just your setup. I think I love this quotation in Robert Falconer, which is often what people say, like, this is the big anti-Calvinist tome, right? And it's got a character that is based on MacDonald's grandmother who burnt the fiddle and who's this really repressive person. And I think it's hard, but I think a lot of us do not read that story well, and we miss what MacDonald's trying to do. He's trying to show us people that have an expression of faith with which we do not agree, which we think is possibly unhealthy. And he says, don't look at them as one-dimensional. They're a full person. This woman is giving up her life to raise orphans. She's educating. And just like his grandmother really did, his grandmother was illiterate because she had a father who didn't think that she learned to read. So as an elderly woman, she raised orphans and taught them how to read so that they wouldn't have this hurdle in life. And there's a beautiful character that we all fall in love with in the story, and we think Miss St. John is so amazing and she's like an angel, and Robert says that she's like an angel. But then we're told, knowing nothing of the grandmother's character, Miss St. John set her down as a cruel and heartless, as well as tyrannical and bigoted old woman, and took the mental position of enmity towards her. And what I think is so ouch about that statement is that's exactly what most of us as readers do. We do that exact same thing. We set her down as cruel and heartless, tyrannical, bigoted. We take a mental position of enmity. And MacDonald's saying that's because you know nothing of her character. You have not spent time to look at who she really is. And MacDonald's son, Ronald especially, talks a lot about how, he says, sentence, bred in a land of religious division, my father's entire fight was against schism. And I think if we're going to be faithful to MacDonald, we have to remember that for him, what he calls the great Sabbath breaker schism, the destroyer of community and communication, was a fundamental foe he proactively combated in writing and practice throughout his life. Ronald says elsewhere, my father, George MacDonald, made no war upon the church as he knew it, whether independent, Presbyterian, or Anglican. His war was upon the faithlessness of the officially faithful, and incidentally, only upon one or two Calvinistic and Augustinian dogmas that were exaggerated out of all proportion to their service. And this statement so completely contradicts so much MacDonald criticism that it's tempting to repeat, no war upon the church as he knew it. Is a great disservice to use MacDonald as a bashing stick to people with whom we disagree theologically, because his whole fight was against schism. This is so important to him, to fight the great Sabbath breaker schism, and I think that's such a good challenge for us today.
I'm hearing Lewis in my head from the Preface to Mere Christianity, where he speaks about it as at her center, the true children dwell. about how you can have those dwelling in the center of Presbyterianism, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and yet somehow something or someone speaks with the same voice. Let's go on to another light subject, German
You're going
Romanticism.
to exhaust me here.
Because Jack explains that when MacDonald was 18, that he spent some months in the north of Scotland cataloguing the library of a great house. Gotta say, that's an assignment far more interesting than any of my summer jobs. But Jack comments that it might have been here that he first came under the influence of German Romanticism.
Mm-hmm.
And he's speaking as though this is something really important. So for those of us who are unaware, what is Romanticism and what kind of influence does it have on MacDonald?
Yeah. There's a quick note as to that library. We actually know very little. There's just suppositions about that library. There's no guarantee that that's where he came across Romanticism. And I think that's important to remember too, that suppositions get repeated by scholars and then they get repeated by scholars.
And built upon each other.
Upon each other. I do know for a fact I've come across a letter from MacDonald to his wife where later when he's starting to study under Scott, after his short time pastoring, he's ill and he's staying at Scott's house. And Scott's library was full of Romantic writers. And he talks about reading Hoffman's Golden Pot and delighting in it and how good it is for him. And so we know for sure that in the mid-50s, he's reading Romanticism, German Romanticism, and books in German, which, when MacDonald's young in the UK, you can name on your fingers the people who speak German. It wasn't very common. And so Scott and Erskine Morris are definitely influences on MacDonald. Whether he came across it in the library, he may or may not. But I think the more important thing about libraries is that libraries are places of relationship for MacDonald, which makes so much sense, right? Books are places that teach us and invite us into relationship with others so then we can go out into the world and practice what we've learned. Romanticism itself, broadly speaking, again, this is something that people argue about regularly. What is Romanticism? Everybody's got a different answer. And part of the reason is Romanticism, in a sense, is almost more a feeling than it is an expressible thing. It was a reaction against what was perceived to be a dehumanizing industrialization that's happening across Europe. It's a reaction against an excessive scientific rationalization of nature, of constraining philosophical, political, and religious orthodoxies. So it's a pushback. And I've heard lots of people say, in the sense, we're kind of in a new era of Romanticism right now. At times, it was a rejection of the precepts of order, of the idealization and rationality that typified classicism and the Enlightenment. It was a reaction against materialism. It wasn't just reaction, it emphasized the individual, it emphasized the subjective, the irrational, the imaginative, the personal, the spontaneous, the emotional, the visionary, the transcendental. And it clashed within itself. It deepened appreciations of the beauty of nature. I think that's sort of key. It demanded a validation of emotion in the senses. It looked closely at the self and human personality and its various moods and potentialities. Is often preoccupied with the genius, the hero, the exceptional figure, but it also demanded new attention to the common man. I think we think of Wordsworth particularly in doing that. It put forth a view of the artist as a supremely individual creator. So it really elevates the artist, whose creative spirit is more important than strict adherence to formal rules and traditional procedures. It emphasizes imagination as a gateway to transcendent experience, to spiritual truth. Sometimes it obsessed over national and ethnic cultural origins. Sometimes it obsessed over the medieval era. It glorified the past. Sometimes it asserted complete freedom from any trappings of tradition. So again, it's hard because sometimes it's doing completely different things. It had a predilection for the exotic, the remote, the mysterious, the weird, the monstrous, the diseased, the unattainable, the numinous. So when C.S. Lewis says that when he came across Phantastes, he had, quote, already been waist deep in Romanticism and likely enough at any moment to flounder into its darker and more evil forms. And I want to highlight that, that he's not saying all Romanticism is bad. He's saying he was being tempted into its darker and more evil forms. That reading Phantastes drew him away from those darker aspects of Romanticism that were tempting him, that kept him sliding into what he calls the perversities that he found in the darker aspects of Romanticism. Yeah. And instead causes him to cross a great frontier. Let's go back to Lewis's to the introduction in the anthology here. When he says, now Phantastes was romantic enough in all consciences, but there was a difference. This is Lewis in the Anthology. Nothing was at that time further from my thoughts in Christianity, and I therefore had no notion of what this difference really was. I was only aware that if this new world was strange, it was also homely and humble, and that's homely being used in the British sense, home-like and humble. That if this was a dream, it was a dream in which one at least felt strangely vigilant, that the whole book had about it a sort of cool morning innocence, and also quite unmistakably a certain quality of death, good death. Now I say death that has life after it's a step into more life. So what it actually did to me was to convert, even to baptize my imagination. I think it's helpful, maybe just a quick overview for probably the many people amongst the listeners who've not read Phantastes, this book that's so significant for Lewis that in the last months of his life, he names it as the top book, which does most to shape his vocational attitude and philosophy life. Phantastes is the story of a young university student, so like close to the age that MacDonald or Lewis is when he first reads it, who's just come into his inheritance. He's about to take over the running of the family estate and be in charge of its servants and laborers as well as its sisters. So he's about to take on all this responsibility. And he is enamored with the concepts of Romanticism, knights in shining armor, of glamour, of being a gentleman. But he only knows, we'll say, the trendy light versions and not the actual tales themselves. Like he actually hasn't dove into the text yet. The story is his journey of learning the true meaning of the word knight, of one who serves. He's got to shift from a knight is like this big, exciting, romantic, medieval concept to a knight is one who serves. And this is his journey in Phantastes. It's an adventure of self-discovery in which he has to learn how to respect all persons, regardless of class, gender, nature, or creed. He has to let others rescue him from monsters. He has to learn humility. He has to learn to work in community. And he learns eventually, not at first, he learns eventually to avoid temptation and to ask for help, frequently from women. So he can't save them. He has to receive help from them. He has to learn to read humbly and not grasp beauty to himself. And then finally, in an honest death to self, he's released to the hard, everyday pragmatism and numinous beauty of serving others. And that's how he becomes a true knight. Let's hop back to MacDonald. MacDonald, the author of this text, he's a farm kid who grew up riding horses in the hills amongst village folk to whom he's related and with whom he's supped and he's worshipped. And he knows the wonder that Romanticism has of nature, the sublime, of the mountains and of the savage people and all these romantic concepts. He knows the wonder that's found out in the fields and the forests and the woods, but he also knows the daily boringness of natural world, that you can scrape your knee and puncture your hand with a thorn. And these peasant folk, the noble savage that's talked about, are actually him, his neighbor, his relatives. And so this being rooted in the reality of this really informs this being a farm kid who grew up rural really shapes what MacDonald writes. So this is some of my navigation and pushback of calling. I think like it's too simplistic to say MacDonald grew up in a Calvinist world. We don't really understand what we mean by that. It's too simplistic to say that MacDonald is a romantic, I think, even, let alone that everything he writes is shaped by Romanticism. And I think in some ways he argues that some of those slightly dangerous and wrong attitudes that Lewis was worried about that are perpetuated by some romantics are, I think you say MacDonald actually argues that's a result of a too urban culture that's kind of disconnected from both actual nature as well as from certain sections of society. And in actuality, nature's neither the terrible sublime, like that's just not reality, right? It isn't this sublime other, nor is it to be understood by being a tourist We don't understand nature by looking at a beautiful romantic painting or even reading a novel. It's back to you got to step out. You got to leave the book and step out. In what at least at one point Lewis calls his favorite realistic novel by MacDonald, What's Mine's Mine. It's really interesting because MacDonald takes us up to the Highlands, up to the area where his family was cleared off the land during the clearances. And he really pushes back at the stereotypical romantic notion that some of the characters in the novel are visitors. They're tourists, and they have this concept of the Highlands. They have a completely romantic concept of the Highlands. And MacDonald explicitly seeks to clarify the distinction between the romantic and, for the moment, let's call it the Celtic ethos. I know that word is complicated, but by portraying Romanticism in conversation with rural Highland life, with Celticity. And I think that's MacDonald's often is putting things in conversation, whether it's Augustine or Plato or Novalis or Wordsworth or Coleridge. He's wanting us to engage in conversation. He's not wholeheartedly going one way or the other on anything. He's wanting us to think. And I think this is something that Lewis really enjoys in MacDonald, is that he's calling us to think better. So in this story, MacDonald uses a pair of young Southern urban sisters as the romantic foils. You can use both small r and large R for that. And then he's got the brothers, the Highland brothers. These women are initially attracted to the country because it's wild, it's untamed. MacDonald uses these words. They idealize the local uncivilized people. And the text says they're attracted to these Highland brothers because, and he uses the word, the text says semi-savages. Like, this is the romantic thing, right? They're exciting, they're exotic because they're semi-savages. The women are intelligent and articulate, but they're sentimental. One struggles with melancholy. They fulfill so many romantic cliches. And at almost every philosophical turn in the novel, they are challenged by the novel's Celtic Highland brothers, who are philosophers who are deeply well-read and also spend time out knowing the land. He belabors the point that what for Londoners is a sublime landscape peopled with uncivilized noble semi-savages, ethereal beauty, wild and tamed, for these brothers, their rural hosts, this is just their home. People with regular humans. That home at times is exceedingly beautiful. At times it's really dangerous, but so is the city, for crying out loud, especially for those of us who are not from the city. The way people live may be different, but they're still human, like the visitors. This land is beautiful, but it's not otherworldly. It's very much their everyday dwelling place. So I think MacDonald is frequently claiming back the othering that happens in Romanticism. And so I think that's why we need to pull back a little bit from saying that he's romantic. He is a romantic writer, because I think in some ways he's wanting us to be critical. Like, yes, he's influenced by Romanticism, but not just Romanticism. He's wanting us to think more critically of it. I don't know. I think he's trying to show us that the Romantic movement can be helpful, important, safeguard against some of the earlier problems I talked about Romanticism having. But instead of projecting onto the other, whether that be nature, humans, or the divine, that we need to seek to know those others in order to truly serve them, which is kind of the journey, that part of the journey Anados is on, that he's got to shift from this romanticizing lens to actually coming to know those with whom he's engaging, to know the tales that he's read, to know the land that he's part of. And I think that sets a really wonderful model for us today, actually, and how we wisely engage with the zeitgeist of our own age, fortifying ourselves with the good and the wise, removing ourselves from evil, but not othering, actually getting to know.
Test all things, hold on to the good.
Yeah.
There were loads of things in Lewis's preface that I enjoyed, and I found instructive. Lewis's comments about how MacDonald considered suffering and his condemnation against anxiety, and saying it wasn't just because he was a Pollyanna, everything's going to be fine. He says his peace of mind came from not building on the future, but from resting in what he called the holy present. And anyone that's read the Screwtape Letters recently will know that this is one of the things that Screwtape does not want the patient to do, not to rest in the present. Also in the preface, and you and I spoke about this back in season 5, as to how Lewis assesses MacDonald's literary rank. He says, well, if we say literature is an art whose medium is words, then MacDonald, he's got no place in the first rank, maybe not even the second. But then he comes to what he sees MacDonald doing really well, which is fantasy. He says a fantasy that hovers between the allegorical and the mythopoetic. And this, in my opinion, he does better than any man. But I did chuckle at what he then goes on to say afterwards, because he talks about MacDonald's good characters. He says they're always the best and most convincing. He says his saints live, his villains are stagey. And it's been a while since I reread this preface, but I laughed when I read that, because it's actually something that I think very much applies to an awful lot of Lewis's books as well. He's very good, like MacDonald, at making holiness attractive, but we could certainly criticize some of his villains for being rather two-dimensional.
Yeah, I'm always going to want to throw in that caveat that we need to stop and think about who's in that first rank and who's in that second rank.
You've got Shakespeare as first rank, so just to say that you're not in the same category as Shakespeare, it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah. And I think to read what he's saying there is really important. Yeah, remembering that he follows up a little later that I hardly know of any writer who seems to be closer, more continuously close to the Spirit of Christ, which ties back into this, I think, the writing goodness versus stagey badness, if you will. I think there's actually, when you stop and think, there's actually aren't a lot of bad characters in MacDonald's literature who stay bad. And there are certainly readers who would have problems with that. There's a few. I think of the Unman, who was not originally from That Hideous Strength, but the phrase comes from Sir Gibbie, which Lewis also loved very much, describing a man named Angus who seems like he's traveled pretty far across the line of badness, let's say. But there's actually a surprising number of, even I can think of numerous bad fathers in MacDonald who are quite bad and quite evil in the story. And then by the end of the tale, slowly, because they are, and this is the caveat, because they are being loved on by their children and the family of their children, actually start to change and start to become more good. And Chesterton also joins Lewis in saying that nobody writes goodness as well as MacDonald. Chesterton also says this. And so I think, one of your questions is, what do you value more? That one writes really well about goodness, or that one, or if you have to choose, writes really well about evil characters or bad characters? And definitely more effort is put into the good. But I think it's also that fact that MacDonald doesn't have many characters that stay in the bad area also is a bit revelatory of his hope for people, and that we can change. But he definitely thinks it's more important and that we have fewer examples of goodness. And that is what his calling is to not paint the darkness and paint the darkness convincingly, but to entice us as readers into the goodness. And he seeks in his writing through the ages, from the classics through scripture and through all the writers since that engage with scripture, he's seeking out, and we see that in his teaching, both in his fiction and in his lectures and his essays. He's seeking out those examples that teach us what goodness is and how to understand goodness better. He's actually got there are people who respond occasionally. There's a couple letters saying, isn't Sir Gibbie a little too good? Can somebody actually be like that? Isn't Diamond in Back to the North Wind a little too good? And MacDonald actually responds. So it's wonderful to be able to have his response back and to know for sure this is what he's seeking to do. But he says that with these characters, he's not trying to write somebody that he would find on the street, an everyday person. He is actually very intentionally trying to write characters that show us how we might be able to live. He's trying to do back to that sermon on childlikeness at the beginning of Unspoken Sermons. He's trying to write characters, write stories that draw us into a better understanding and actually equip us to do what Christ is calling us to do. when he says, you must become as one of these. And I think the important, interesting distinction between Diamond in Back of the North Wind and Gibbie in Sir Gibbie is Diamond in some ways kind of fits the Victorian trope of stories that has the child who dies early. So it's easy to argue, like, sure, Diamond had a hard life. So, so he was good. It is admirable that he was so good in the story despite how hard life was, but he dies as a kid. As we all know, becoming an adult is a whole nother thing. It's pretty hard. And you can't, how do you stay childlike as an adult? And interesting, lots of people forget that that's a really important part of Sir Gibbie is he doesn't stay this little kid who is Christ-like, who seeks to live in the goodness as much as possible. I love the phrase of how Gibbie lives in a way that is so hard for most of us. He lives in the holy carelessness of the eternal now.
Mm.
But really importantly in that story, Gibbie grows up. He gets older. He becomes a student. And as a student, we're told that he excels academically. He could be winning all the prizes, but in a very childlike fashion, he instead chooses to not get all the prizes and instead help his friends understand the material better because his drive is different. And then he becomes an adult and he gets married. A young man goes through romance and gets married. And we see other characters in the story who aren't able to be childlike academics, who aren't able to be childlike adults, as well as some who learn from Gibbie how to be so. And so MacDonald's showing us in that story very intentionally trying to model what we can be. He's trying to give us an example to say, look, see, it is possible for us to live as Christ calls us to do. And so he tries to do what Toni Morrison talks about in, I think, a really wonderful lecture she gives before her death, where she says, in our age, we tend to give evil the intellectual platform. And sort of the same thing that Lewis is talking about. Like, we think evil is cool. We think evil is the most interesting. All those arguments about Milton Satan being more interesting.
That's exactly where my head was at. There's a reason that there's people thinking that, well, he's the most interesting character because, evil is much more enticing. But I think it's actually much harder to write goodness. And Lewis said that himself when he tried to write the angelic version of the Screwtape Letters. He says, it would just have to drip with heaven, and I'm not a good enough writer. Disagree. But anyway, I think it's much harder to write goodness. And that is something that both MacDonald and Lewis do well. And it always puts me in mind of one of Lewis's essays where he says, since it's so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, that's guaranteed. Let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage.
Yeah, amen, amen. Since my 20s, in talking to people who read MacDonald repeatedly, all over the world, people say the reason that they're drawn to his novels, to his realistic novels, as well as his fiction, but in this area, especially his realistic novels, is because they cannot read them without wanting to become better people. They feel like they are more good at the end of the story. They love goodness more. They love God's call to goodness more for having read the stories. And that's years of hearing people. And just recently I heard of I heard that from a young man in his 20s. When I was in Oxford teaching, doing tutorials, I had students who weren't Christians who were like, do I have to read this stuff? And they, after reading Fantastes, one young man said, the reason I like this is like, it makes me want to be good. That's a special gift. And MacDonald doesn't do it on his own. He does it because he's engaging with other writers through the years before him who are seeking out the same thing. He's very intentional about that.
Yeah. And with all this, it's easy to see why Lewis found him so significant in his own life. You already mentioned the big quotation where he says, I know hardly any other writer that seems to be closer, or at least continually close to the Spirit of Christ himself.
Like, that's crazy, that statement.
That's a bold statement. And he wraps up the preface by saying that producing this is a debt of justice because of the difference that he made to his life. And that's why I'm very ashamed to say it took us this long to get to a MacDonald month, but we've done it now.
You've done it. You've done it.
As we wrap up and as we celebrate George MacDonald's 200th birthday this year, what are your hopes for the bicentenary and the future of MacDonald's studies?
It would make me so happy if Lewis scholars decided to take the time to listen to Pints with Jack.
Me too.
And listen to Lewis. I mean, Lewis, to read that introduction and anthology well, and to see, oh yeah, okay, Lewis doesn't think he's perfect. And I think Lewis actually bends over backwards to try to make it clear that this is not hagiography on his part about MacDonald. I think that's part of the reason he belabors the areas in which he doesn't agree with MacDonald or thinks MacDonald doesn't do certain things perfectly or well, or even like he's like, I wish that had been better. I think he really belabors those things because I think he kind of feels like otherwise he sounds like he's doing hagiography, because he does say repeatedly, there's, some people, Boethius shaped their theology. Some people, it's Augustine who really shaped their faith and the concept of God. For me, it's MacDonald. I know of no one closer to the Spirit of Christ than MacDonald. The pill was gilded all the way through. I get to the end of my life and I realize MacDonald has been shaping my faith and the way I think about literature and the way I teach my entire life. I think if Lewis scholars took time to really carefully read that introduction and read it well, that you can't get to the end of it and walk away thinking it's possible to be a Lewis scholar without reading MacDonald and not just the anthology. I mean, the anthology, Lewis says, this is to give you an idea of his theology, and some of the theological stuff I think is important. But just like the phrase, Aslan is not a tame lion, it doesn't really mean much to people who've not read Narnia. But if you've read Narnia, oh my gosh, that means so much, right? And so, of course, the anthology is going to be a bunch of short, pithy quotations that give some sense of his theology. But if you really want to enter the story and be shaped by MacDonald's characters like you have by Aslan, you need to enter the stories. And I think to be a good Lewis scholar, Lewis himself says, he says, please take me seriously. Like, he always sounds a little ticked off in his introduction. Nobody's taking me seriously. So I think for Lewis scholars themselves, and it will require going back into literature and becoming better literature scholars. If you're going to pay attention to MacDonald's influence on Lewis, I would love to see that happen. But I'd also love to see people, there's been a lot of work on MacDonald Romanticism, and just now we're starting to see MacDonald and Shakespeare and Dante. Romanticism was it was an influence on MacDonald, but such a tiny sliver compared to everything else. Shakespeare's huge, Dante's huge, yes, but Herbert, massive. Spencer, massive. Sidney, so significant. And it goes on and on and on. Your medieval lit, your patristics. And I think the more we dive into MacDonald in those ways, the more we do better literary critical study, and the more we look at his life and how, exactly like he said, that as academics or Christians or readers, if we only dwell on the life of the mind, we're going to become poisoned. And so to take a look at how he takes those stories of the Christian literary tradition and is shaped by them and says, oh, we have to go out and apply these things that we're learning. We have to live these things. We have to feed the orphans and the widows. We need to fight for the rights of those who cannot fight for themselves, is to read MacDonald well. And I'd love to see more attention spent on some of his practice for fighting for education for working class people, fighting for education of women, fighting for the environment, fighting against land being taken away from people in poor housing. There's so many areas where he really applies those things, which is why you have people like Florence Nightingale that carry their handwritten versions of MacDonald's novels to battle, and why Lilias Trotter says she is completely shaped in her whole ministry by MacDonald, because this is MacDonald's really calling us to not compartmentalize our lives, but to integrate them. The arts, literature, praxis, all informed and shaped by our faith. And I think until we start studying him more widely, beyond just these little slivers, we're not going to really see that and get that. And I think he's got a lot to say to us for our day and age. As we've said before, Chesterton was right, that his time was yet to come, and it's coming now. It's amazing. This year alone is showing how MacDonald's studies are burgeoning, the music that's being done, the movies that are being done, the literary work being inspired is exciting, but may it all be in the spirit of weaving our lives back together so that we're less compartmentalized, but also weaving us back to each other and with Christ so that we're fighting schism, turning our eyes towards Christ, which is what MacDonald's calling us to, instead of fighting with each other.
What a way to end. Dr. Jeffrey Johnson, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, David. It was delightful to be here.
And can you please tell us where people can find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson is my website, so you can pop over there and take a look. But I'd be even more excited to direct you to the George MacDonald Society website, where you will see links to other sites, but also just introductions to so many different people who are working on MacDonald today in so many different ways. Come join us.
And I hear the call for final drinks, so thanks to our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah, our intern, Julia. Thanks to all of our listeners and patron supporters, particularly our top-tier supporters, Mary Margaret, Aldo, Alex, James, Matt, Erica, Joelle, Amanda, Thomas, Bud1, Bud2, Shane, Kay, Paul, Gary, Stephen, Kelly, Chris, John, James, Kate, Peter, David, Angela, and Rowdy. Pray for you every single time we release an episode, and we keep a close eye on our prayer requests on our Slack channel. If you've enjoyed this episode, please pick up a copy of George MacDonald, because on Thursday, Andrew and Matt will be joining me as we share some of our favorite quotations from that anthology. So please join us then when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.